Everything has been so rich so far, Andrea. I mean, there's so many places to kind of jump in here. But my deepest sense has to do with, how powerful and chaotic these times are that we find ourselves in. And that for me, and everything I say here is really for me. I want to emphasize that I don't have any answers for anybody. I don't know if I have any answers for myself at this point, but the track that I've been following that does feel rich is going down deep into the stillness, into what we can call a still point. And that every time I hear somebody kind of broadcasting that they have the answers for us, it just makes me cringe. And I think about that saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Right? Anybody who's proclaiming that they are the Buddha, they have the answers. It just seems there are no solutions. So that goes back to what you were sharing earlier about the impasse. Mm-hmm. And for me, it has to do with just sinking deeper and deeper into silence and the richness of the silence between the notes, between the words, between the sounds, the thoughts, the emotions. That's where the guidance is, in that individual silence. And we all reach it in our own way, through our own bodies and our connection with the natural world, whether we're out walking in silence or sit with a tree, or sit with the river. Sit under, we have a beautiful Scorpio full moon eclipse coming up. That's what we're working towards right now. What a powerful container for going into the depths and that dark stillness. It's so rich. So I have more, but Betsy.
Thank you, Cassandra and Andrea, and my apologies for being late. I love, in a sense, it kind of fits with the Rainmaker story that we're in this kind of liminal space. And I'm really glad that I made it in time for this conversation. I love the Rainmaker story. And it was probably already said before that, Jung requested to Barbara Hanna that she tell this story every time she gives a lecture. And Jung would tell that, Carl Jung would tell that story quite frequently. And people would sigh like, oh, have we heard the story so many times? But they would pretend that they've heard it for the first time just to appease him in some ways. But I think the reason why that story needs to be told so often is that I don't think we quite ever get it. When I tell the story to my students, where I teach at Pacifica Graduate Institute, I just open it up and say, what does the story bring up for you? And almost immediately we fall into this kind of cause and effect thinking. And I think what you were referring to, Cassandra, is like, there is no answers. As soon as we look for an answer, we're falling into this kind of old mode of thinking of like, we can fix something. If we could just find what the problem is, we can fix it. And the Rainmaker story tells us there's something that we don't know. There's something that we don't know. And maybe that's the still point. Even still, it's like, well, if we could just get to the still point, we would find the answer. And it's, again, we kind of just default into that perspective. So I think it's being willing to hold the unknown and to court that mystery is what we're about. And being myself, somebody who has been conditioned by Western society, that's always the question that I have to carry is, what am I missing here from everything that I have been conditioned to see and to believe and to feel? And how do we find a way to go into a place where we can avoid that. How do we create, and I think this is what the title of this webinar, Sanctuary. How do we create sanctuary where we can allow the broken pieces, the unknown pieces, the fractured pieces to begin to inform us?
At the beginning, Betsy, we had a meditation where I asked people to rest at the bottom of their empty breath to see if you could elongate, even for a second or two, emptiness and relax in emptiness. And then the fill that comes with that does come with new appreciation. And I think of how when I'm tense, my breathing shortens, it comes up, and there's no relaxing in that emptiness. And then comes the impulse to get busier, faster, and even more disconnected. So what you're talking about, Cassandra, of the abilities to stay in that stillness, and Betsy, you're saying no solutions, just being with that. That is radical.
Mm-hmm.
It's radical because we're not going to look that smart. We're not going to save the world. We're not going to be impressive. We're just going to be present to ourselves, first of all. And this utter simplicity of that often eludes me in my day. So I appreciate this. Cassandra, when we were speaking the other day, you brought up that Hindu goddess, that the never not broken goddess. Would you like to talk about her a bit?
Well, I'm sitting with this idea of never not broken, and also how funny this has been with the techno glitch and the time glitch, and in a way I'm allowing myself to drop into the imperfection of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of perfection and brokenness, I'm just sitting with those two ideas. And I think one of the kind of the most wounding that I see, I am also a psychotherapist, is in the women that I work with, I work primarily with women, is this idea of perfection. There's this ideal of perfection that's constantly hovering above many of us all the time. And it is a disembodied concept, perfection. It doesn't have the capacity for brokenness because it's not even embodied. It's a concept. And it's so painful. It's very, in some ways, one-sided, patriarchal in a sense. And so when we get back into the body, and the body being like, this is us humans here talking together. I mean, we're on a screen, but we're all sitting in our embodied places with our very much imperfect situations and messy lives and technological glitches. There's so much soul and softness in that. It just makes it real. And it's a re-engagement with our lives as they are. So it is a brokenness, but it's a sacred brokenness. It's a antidote to perfection, and it's rebellious. And I like what you say, it's radical. To love that, to really love our imperfection, is a radical act. So that's where I was going, and thank you for asking, because I think the thoughts just sort of started to connect as I was saying them.
Mhm. I experience quite a quality of intimacy when I can be in my vulnerability. Another word for brokenness is that tender vulnerability, and share that with someone that I trust. I mean, I'm not going to go out into the grocery store and say, I'm feeling very vulnerable right now. But when there is enough sacredness to hold um, beautiful vulnerability, then that seems to open something
Mhm.
that allows an unexpected flow to happen. And those go very, very deep in my heart. They just make an impression that lasts. And that feels to me like the new ground, the new place where possibilities begin to come. So radical tenderness and vulnerability, yeah, that's my leading edge these days. Yours sounds like, Cassandra, stillness. A real allegiance to stillness. Um, so yeah.
I think in all of this, there's a kind of surrender, a sacred surrender of admitting what we don't know, or acknowledging what's not working, and um, allowing ourselves to go down into those depths. That's like the face of the dark goddess, the dark feminine, that we also don't like to look at. It's the dark side of the moon. And I think that Akilandeshvari is one of the dark goddesses, along with many others. And those are the teachings that we don't really want to face up to. That requires a sacred surrender, the descent of the goddess into the underworld, and facing the death of a life that no longer works.
Yeah.
Yeah, that vulnerability is a sacred state.
Yeah. It reminds me in my work with the School of Lost Borders, where we send people out on the land. And I don't know if you talked a little bit about this kind of going into the threshold place on a solo on the land with intention, like a wilderness rites of passage ceremony. The healing that I've seen that comes about really is being mirrored by a natural world that is beautifully imperfect. I have seen people go out who have experienced enormous traumas, or in the midst of gender identity transition and not knowing who they are and not being mirrored back in a loving way by society, are marginalized somehow. And to the point where even humans are just being in the presence of other human beings is too threatening, too risky. But going out into nature, which is a big term, nature encompasses a lot, to be mirrored by so much imperfection in a way, I wouldn't go to a tree and say, you're not good enough, or you're too tall or too big or not smart. There's just this incredible resonance that happens, I think. It's a deep empathy between the inner and the outer realms that I've witnessed to be essential to really knowing who we are, which is very diverse. We're interconnected with all of the living beings that make the world that we live in.
Mhm. Mhm. That word resonance, um, when you take people out, and I know both of you have done wilderness rites of passage work, when you take people out into the wilderness and they have that experience of resonance out of the human to human realm, how does that last in their body souls afterwards?
I'm sorry, how does that what in their
How
body?
how does that last? How does it sustain in their body souls afterwards when they return to the human world? Any thoughts on that?
I work a lot with these rites of passage in the wilderness as transformational writing retreats.
Mm-hmm.
And so the writing, and some people are songwriting, it's all kinds of creative endeavor that will kind of fuel this rite of passage, for lack of a better expression. And so we continue to work with that and go deeper into the creative process.
Mm-hmm.
And the creative process lives in the courageousness of our hearts,
Mm-hmm.
and it lives in the intuitive wisdom of our bellies. It lives in the soles of our feet, walking on the earth herself as she communicates with us. So I think all of those ways will resonate, but it's really the creative force that we're tapping into that continues, that lasts.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'll just tag on that, a lot of people, when they contact me or other people doing this type of work, that I want to go out on a rite of passage ceremony, often it's because I'm stuck, or I feel like my life isn't right, or I have issues I want to overcome. So there's this sense of going out to achieve something. But what really turns out to be most transformative is not that, as we've already talked about, but to experience oneself just as one is, and to feel that creative impulse, but also to feel as part of something, the greater that's around them, and to be mirrored back by that, and to be accepted just as they are. So I think the feeling part is really important, to actually feel it emotionally and in one's body, not just in one's head about what this experience is supposed to be like. And then it becomes like a meditation practice. It's not a one-shot deal. It's something that we return to again and again, to remember, and really, like, we are remembering who we are as ultimately precious children of this earth, all of us, with all our problems, with all our shadow, with all of our wounds. We're no different than a sapling of a tree that's growing out in the forest. It's like, here I am. I belong here.
So you're describing the sense of beingness, Betsy, and you're describing the creative process. And I see these as a kind of a yin yang complement to each other, that this is what happens when we really surrender to the wilderness within, or in the outer wilderness. And I know that both of you said when we were having our original conversation that you can't even see things in this unprecedented time like this. Well, we'll just go on a rite of passage and then we'll figure things out. But still, some of the principles apply. So I appreciate what you are saying about the creative impulse that arises and the deep being, surrendered beingness as part of this weave. Do you have any other thoughts before we go into our breakout room? Because we're going to let the women gather in groups of 3 for 15 minutes and discuss these. So any parting things you might want to add before we move into the rooms?
I think I just want to add that I'm tentative about even using the phrase rite of passage these days. And the 3 of us had this conversation earlier in the week because it kind of implies this overcoming, getting through the hero's journey. And what I'm beginning to experience in my own life, and I see it in others, is it's more mysterious than that, that something in us, if we somehow just can pay attention to it, begins to create itself in our own depths. And I think a part of it for me anyway has been learning to trust that even in spite of my failings and my struggles, that something is beginning to develop. And I would say like a pearl in an oyster. I use that metaphor a lot. And so the sanctuary, I think, that we're talking about offers us a place to recognize that.
Thank you. That resonates too. Cassandra, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, that kind of brings up for me, Betsy, in talking about how those various containers that we've used in the past just don't seem to be the right avenue anymore. And coming back again to a little bit of astrology, it's the that Virgo and Pisces are directly opposite one another in the zodiac. So there's a complementarity between Virgo and Pisces. And to me, those are the most powerful teachings in that realm, in that Virgo is representing our everyday lives, and it's really the sacredness of our everyday lives. It's the practice of being, who we are, where we are, in the moment with presence, and that teaches us discernment, and that intuitive discernment is what gives us direct access to the Pisces element, which is spirit, which is our connection to our own wisdom and the greater wisdom, same thing. And so it's really just our ability to sit with the discomfort of everyday life and live through it and do what needs to be done, but the presence and the willingness taught how to see with that inner vision is what takes us into the beauty of spirit in the Pisces.
Wonderful. Thank you. Such a rich conversation.